Welcome to this explainer. Today, we are going to dive deep into the rich, lived reality of Buddhism. We're unpacking an incredibly complex 2,500-year history, and along the way, we're definitely going to dispel some of those really common Western cliches. As we dig into these sources together, you'll see that there is just so much more to this than we might initially think. Let's get started. So, is Buddhism just mindfulness, relaxation, and, well, spa decor? If you walk through pretty much any modern Western city, you'd probably think so, right? You'll see Buddha heads in wellness centers, mandalas printed on yoga mats, and hear the word mindfulness pitched as some sort of corporate productivity hack. But this modern cliché reduces a massive, incredibly diverse world religion to a secular stress relief tool that's been entirely stripped of its ethics, its rituals, and its community. Today, we're going to look at the fascinating reality behind the symbol. Here is our roadmap for this explainer. We'll hit more than meditation, map out the 3 great paths, explore texts and languages, check out lived practice and rituals, examine modern Buddhism, and wrap it all up with diversity without devaluation. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, More Than Meditation, a Lived Institution. The absolute crucial point we need to get our heads around here is that traditional Buddhism, it is far more than just sitting quietly on a cushion. It's a highly complex, deeply rooted social institution, encompassing strict ethical codes, beliefs in the cycles of rebirth, and intricately organized communities. And this brilliantly illustrates our first major concept, the Sangha. The Sangha is the community of practitioners, and it relies heavily on the interdependent monastic community of monks and nuns. It's a really fascinating ecosystem. Lay people support these monasteries with donations, a practice known as dana, or generosity, and they earn religious merit in the process. The monastics, in return, provide teachings, rituals, and spiritual guidance. This reciprocal relationship is literally what stabilizes the entire social and religious structure of traditional Buddhist societies. Moving right along to Section 2, the 3 great paths, mapping the tradition. So as these teachings spread out from India, they naturally evolved into 3 major historical paths, and they were shaped deeply by the distinct geographies, political landscapes, and local cultures they bumped into over the centuries. Let's map this out. We have Theravada, which is prominent in South and Southeast Asia, centering on the Arhat ideal. Then we have Mahayana, rooted in East Asia, focusing on the Bodhisattva ideal. And finally, Vajrayana, primarily found in Tibet and the Himalayas, focused on tantric transformation. But a quick caveat here. These paths overlap, they interact, and they share foundational teachings like the Four Noble Truths and the concept of karma. They are definitely not strictly separate, walled-off religions. Let's put the ideals of those first 2 side by side. We have Theravada's individual liberation, represented by the Arhat, versus Mahayana's universal liberation, the Bodhisattva. Now, the Arhat is a practitioner who achieves liberation from suffering through rigorous personal discipline and deep analytical insight into the nature of reality. But please don't mistake individual for selfish. Theravada still places a massive emphasis on community and compassion. Mahayana, however, takes universal compassion and makes it the absolute center of its philosophy, pushing the idea that no one is truly, fully liberated until all beings are liberated. Let's zoom in on that bodhisattva ideal for a second. A bodhisattva is a being who strives for enlightenment strictly for the benefit and liberation of all living beings. This concept is brilliant because it perfectly links compassion with wisdom. In Mahayana thinking, if you truly grasp the emptiness of all things, meaning that nothing exists totally independently and everything is interconnected, then the suffering of others is quite literally not separate from your own. This profound idea is what shaped major global traditions, from the silent meditation of Zen all the way to the devotional practices of Pure Land Buddhism. And then we have Vajrayana, which is often visually represented by the mandala. Let's de-exoticize this right now. Vajrayana isn't some kind of exotic magic, which, by the way, is a terrible, reductive cliché. Actually, scratch that. It is a highly rigorous system of psychological and spiritual transformation. It uses tools like mandalas, these incredibly complex cosmic diagrams, along with recited mantras and intense teacher-student relationships with lamas. The whole goal here is to use symbolic systems to rapidly transform negative emotions and the ordinary mind into deep, penetrating insight. All right, Section 3, Text and Languages. The power of translation. These different paths are built on entirely different foundations of text. Think of it like a timeline unfolding across 4 distinct eras. We start in Era 1 with the early origins and the Pali Canon, which forms the sheer bedrock of Theravada. Centuries later, in Era 2, massive new collections of sutras were written in Sanskrit and translated into Chinese, forming the basis of Mahayana. Pushing into Era 3, we see the highly technical Tibetan translations of tantras for Vajrayana. And today, in Era 4, we're in the modern era of global digital archives. When these concepts moved from Indian languages to Chinese conceptual frameworks, then to Tibetan precision, and finally to modern English, the core ideas inevitably shifted to fit the new cultural mindsets. Translation acts as a fundamental form of interpretation that quite literally changes a religion.
So the really crucial point here is the power of the canon itself. Translation isn't just swapping words out, it is active interpretation. But more than that, canonization, the act of deciding what texts are actually official, involves immense institutional power. Think about it. Whoever controls the canon decides who actually gets the authority to teach. Furthermore, different canons create entirely different visions of the Buddha. Is he a historical teacher to be emulated, like we see in the Pali Canon? Or is he a cosmic, transcendent deity to be revered, as seen in later Mahayana texts? The texts absolutely dictate the reality of the practice. Which brings us to Section 4, Lived Practice and Rituals Beyond the Cushion.
Let's step away from the text for a minute and explore what practicing Buddhists actually do every day. Spoiler alert, historically, most haven't spent their days sitting in silent meditation. Instead, practice is deeply physical and communal. We see merit-making, prostrations, chanting, visualizations, lighting candles at shrines, going on long pilgrimages, and celebrating massive festivals. These rituals actually serve as a sort of bodily pedagogy. They train the mind through the body. Bowing to a shrine isn't just some intellectual acknowledgement. It is a physical, bodily cultivation of humility, gratitude, and ethical discipline. Now, let's bring it into the present. Section 5, Modern Buddhism, the impact of globalization. Globalization, mass migration, digital media, they are all profoundly reshaping this 2,500-year-old tradition. We're seeing this massive rise in secular mindfulness, the explosive growth of transnational teacher networks, and, of course, heavily commercialized symbols. Our sources point out a really significant tension here. Globalization has made Buddhist concepts incredibly accessible, sure, but it risks stripping away the underlying ethics and concepts of rebirth. Profound, demanding spiritual teachings are frequently turned into depoliticized self-optimization tools, completely driven by a media logic that prefers a quick soundbite over rigorous discipline. And obviously, this brings a very real risk of cultural appropriation. Finally, Section 6, Diversity Without Devaluation, How to Compare. So how on earth do we make sense of all this massive, sometimes completely contradictory diversity? Well, it really comes down to a brilliant concept from our German sources, Vergleichen ohne Abwertung, which basically translates to comparing without devaluing. This is the core ethos for studying literally any global tradition. We have to learn to compare these distinct traditions based purely on their specific focuses. We really need to stop ranking them as better or worse, more authentic or corrupted, smaller or greater. They are simply different systems, brilliantly adapted for different cultural and spiritual needs. I absolutely love this quote from the source material. A fair comparison asks about focuses, historical conditions, and practice goals, not what is right or wrong. By applying this, we completely avoid those lazy cliches we talked about earlier. We stop calling Theravada selfish, we stop calling Mahayana the only compassionate path, and we definitely stop treating Vajrayana as exotic magic. Understanding the historical conditions and the highly specific goals of the practice is absolutely essential to grasping the rich, incredibly adaptable reality of global Buddhism. And that brings us to a final question for you to ponder. How are you going to view mindfulness or Buddhist symbols the next time you bump into them in your daily life? The next time you see a Buddhist statue used as lobby decoration or an app selling you an ancient meditation technique, I challenge you to look right past that commercialized wellness trend. Remember the texts, the complex rituals, the bodily pedagogy, and the deep, lived history of the millions of people who have carried this tradition forward. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep asking questions and keep learning.